Find your future by exploring your world. The Massachusetts School of Law challenges their students to explore the important issues of our time, learning from experts in fields like politics, sports, and business law. From first-hand accounts and dramatic reenactments, in-depth conversations with society's leaders, from historians to lawyers, from high-tech professionals to environmental experts. The Massachusetts School of Law at Andover presents MSLAW.edu.
Hello and welcome to today's show. For over 30 years, MSL has provided this programming as a public service to address important topics not extensively examined in the media. Our focus today is on two serious mental health issues: postpartum depression and recovery from sexual violence. A short time ago, a horrible tragedy near my home brought to my attention postpartum depression. Research tells me that it affects up to 15% of people. Although I knew many new mothers, if not most, suffer from the so-called baby blues in the first few weeks after delivery, I was very unfamiliar with the specifics of postpartum depression and how devastating it can be. Much more public information is necessary. Recently, there was coverage of the topic when the New Yorker released an interview with the father of 3 children killed in Duxbury, Massachusetts, by their mother. Let's look beyond the headlines and sound bites and dig a bit deeper into these topics. Joining me today are Amy Colazzo, a licensed clinical social worker and a certified perinatal mental health provider. She is board co-chair of the Mass chapter of Postpartum Support International. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Donna Kosick, a seasoned professional in the field of mental health counseling, community-based clinical services, and mental health and domestic violence training. She currently is a clinical director at Elliott Community Human Services. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
And Deborah Fallon-Rambos. Deborah is the founder, director of Portal to Hope, a nonprofit organization committed to helping victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking crimes. I am proud to say she's also a student at the Massachusetts School of Law. Deb, thank you.
Thank you for having us.
And I'm Diane Sullivan, your host for today's show. Amy, distinguish for the audience, if you would, the difference between baby blues, postpartum depression, and postpartum psychosis.
Sure. So when we look at any perinatal mental health, we're looking at anything that affects somebody during the course of a pregnancy up to 1 year after birth. And the research shows us that 80% of new parents will have the baby blues. We expect that it will look like low mood, some tearfulness, but it kind of comes and goes and it's not pervasive. When we look at a postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, or any other more significant perinatal mental health mood disorders, they last longer. And so we distinguish it based on the frequency and the intensity. And so with the baby blues, we expect it goes away after 2, maybe 3 weeks. Anything after 3 weeks, we want to see people in their doctor's offices. We want to see them in our offices for assessment. When you ask about postpartum psychosis, I cannot stress enough, is always a medical mental health emergency. It always requires an assessment at the emergency department and making sure people have access and know where to go. What it looks like, it usually occurs within the first 2 weeks of birth. It will be a rapid onset of symptoms. Again, it can occur later on during a postpartum experience, but we most often see it pretty soon after birth, and we distinguish it based on symptoms. And so when we're looking to differentiate what could be a postpartum depression, what could be a psychosis or an OCD, a true psychotic episode is a break from reality. So having thoughts, hearing voices, maybe seeing things, and really not feeling like themselves. Postpartum psychosis can be tricky. It comes and goes. It waxes and wanes. And so I think there's a misconception that if somebody has a psychotic episode, they are psychotic all the time. And what we know is that it can come and go. So it can be a little bit trickier to diagnose and catch, which is why we want to make sure people know what to look for and then who to call and where to go for help.
And we'll talk about that in a bit. But first, I want to ask, for the benefit of the audience, whether men suffer from these same mental health illnesses.
They do. So we know that the research shows us for birthing individuals, the numbers are about 1 in 5 will have a perinatal mood disorder, and non-birthing partners, which can be dads, it can be adoptive parents, is about 1 in 10 for new dads specifically will have a postpartum mood or anxiety disorder.
And do you treat men different than the mom who delivered the baby?
Well, treatment will look different in terms of when we're looking for support. And so oftentimes I'll be referring to support groups or looking for community support. And so we just want to make sure that people are getting support within their own community, whatever that community looks like, whether it's male, female, the queer population, adoptive parents. But really anybody that's touched with children or childbirth or pregnancy can be impacted by a perinatal mood disorder.
Is it a misconception to think that those who suffer from postpartum depression come with, previous mental health issues?
It's not necessarily a misconception. When we look at it, we're looking at risk factors. And so a risk factor for a perinatal mood disorder, one of the risk factors could be a prior history of their own mental health, also family history, hormone changes, so sensitivity to birth control, sensitivity to periods. These are all those risk factors that we're looking at. And then we look at the bigger system. What does a family support look like? If a family is struggling to access adequate housing, adequate food, they're more at risk for a mental health condition.
What is the most effective treatment, as each of you see it, to help a woman or a man who's suffering with postpartum either depression or psychosis?
Those are two very different things, and I think it's important that we kind of don't lump all perinatal mood disorders into either depression or psychosis, but kind of give an accurate postpartum mood disorders. When I say that, I'm including postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum OCD, postpartum PTSD, so any birth trauma, which is anything that a birthing person or their partner experienced, and psychosis and bipolar. These are all under the umbrella. When we're looking at adequate treatment, our first step would be diagnosing, so making sure we're catching people, making sure we're screening individuals and families, and then treatment can look different depending on those diagnoses, but often we're looking at sleep. Sleep is the number one thing I talk with all of my clients about.
I bet.
And we know that, babies come out and they are not attuned to the sleep that the families need. And so making sure families have a good, adequate sleep plan, whether treatment means talking to a professional like a talk therapist like myself, medication as an option, support groups, family support. That one caveat I would add is postpartum psychosis, again, is always an emergency and always has to be treated as such with emergency providers, whether that's the emergency department, talking with a psychiatrist right away, or any of our hotlines with adequately trained individuals.
Do a lot of women, out of fear of people thinking they're not adequate, refuse to get the help they need?
Sure. I think stigma contributes a lot to undertreatment and underreporting. A stigma within people's own communities, racism, implicit biases within our own medical system, people not wanting to speak up to their own providers for the fear of not being believed or being questioned. These are all barriers that inhibit people from getting treatment.
How does it impact bonding with the baby if you suffer from any of these mental health disorders?
One of the biggest messages I always like to tell people is that these are conditions that are treatable. And so when we look at your question about bonding, I would look at what is an untreated mood disorder and the impact that could have on attachment versus, somebody who's suffering from a postpartum mood disorder and is in treatment. They're doing well with their baby, and we're making sure that they do well with their baby, whether it's if they need to be separated for a period of time because of any hospitalizations, ensuring that they're getting adequate support and access to their baby, and really focusing on what they are doing well. Bonding doesn't always happen immediately, like some of the stories and movies, people have a baby and it's instant love, which is not the case for a lot of families. And so an untreated perinatal mood disorder can have an impact on bonding. But again, I really want to stress that there's treatment and there's help for people.
When I was prepping for the show, in my mind, I wanted to distinguish the different types of mental health issues that arise. And what it seemed to suggest is when you're talking about postpartum psychosis, there are actual attempts on the mom, if it's the mom who's suffering from it, and the baby at their lives. Is that been your experience? Or are there earlier symptoms where it mostly gets caught?
So when we look at the numbers of postpartum psychosis, it's about 1 to 2 in 1,000 births will have a mom who's experiencing a psychotic episode, postpartum psychosis. Within that number, it's even smaller, those that attempt to harm their children or attempt to harm themselves. And so postpartum psychosis is treatable, and we really want people to know that we can intervene before a tragedy happens. And so making sure people know what the symptoms look like and where to go for help. The tragedies make headlines, but that is not the majority of cases.
That is good to hear. What do you look for first and foremost in a new mom?
First thing I think I would look at is any signs of being sad. We know that after birth hormones rage and there's mood swings, but to kind of keep our eye on that, talk to the partner who's at home. What does the support look like? It's hard to pull out one specific thing because there's many, I think as Amy described, there's many aspects that someone comes into giving birth and the results of that birth process. So I think we would just try to stress with the family that if they see that the mom is struggling, she's different than she was 2 months ago.
I, who have never had children, sit back and say, how could you not be struggling? I mean, you've gone through this tremendous body change. The likelihood is probably high that you have a baby that's crying in the middle of the night. You may have a baby with colic. You got to be like, oh, I'm going to pull out my hair at a minimum, because it's got to be quite a change for people to adjust to.
I have 4 children. I think I wanted to pull my hair out more when they were teenagers than after I gave birth. But it's really looking to the support system, to yourself, going back to the doctor for that 6-week checkup and being honest. There is a great stigma around, when you give birth, you will become a mother and you'll love that child. And as Amy said, that's not always the case.
And sure, you must feel guilty.
Of course, nothing like mother guilt.
And so you hide it.
Just to compliment what both Donna and Amy are saying, I think those feelings of inadequacy, when we have people around us that demonstrate motherhood is, a breeze. I mean, I'm the daughter of a woman who had 11 children.
Wow.
And I don't know how she did it, but going back to intervention being very key, I think, and also, as Donna was saying, looking at what the support systems are. For when we were talking earlier with my classmates about stories that are uncovered, as you say, they're more isolated. The ones that we are hearing about anyway, what's brought to us through the media and these types of forums, bringing about awareness. We hear those kind of more isolated cases. That's probably not even the right term, Amy, but we're hearing about the 1 to 2 cases. But for police departments, where we work on site at police departments, and for law enforcement officers, as the officers who spoke earlier today, I think there's a need for having clinicians like Donna on site at departments, having advocates like those at Portal to Hope on site, so that we can help to provide and soften even the support, because people who are suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, postpartum depression, there can be sometimes a disconnect even, and having an awareness from the law enforcement standpoint, who may be the first person responding to an incident at which a spouse might be afraid of, what's going on in the home, maybe the disconnect with the newborn baby, the anxiety, depression that's going on there. When they're calling for help, they're likely going to call the police department. And so it's important that we're talking about this today, and educating people, but also to make sure that people are equipped, as you said earlier, Amy, making sure that our systems that are in place to help people, hospitals, police departments, that we have, the means to be able to intervene and help in the right ways.
What if mom doesn't want, or it could be dad, they don't want help? Then what do you do?
I was going to say, then we really support the family members on making sure that they have adequate support. I think Deb and Donna both brought up great points of screening, right? Like you mentioned at the 6-week postpartum appointment, making sure people are being honest. But the reality is that many postpartum mood disorders can occur within that first year. And if you're not going back to your doctor after 6 weeks because there's no more needs for checkups, making sure that all systems who access any families, pediatricians, emergency departments, police departments, all have adequate training on what to look for. And the best we can do if somebody doesn't want to get help is just keep encouraging them, making sure they're staying safe, making sure baby is safe. And I think the best thing is that we can destigmatize. There's nothing wrong with them. They're not alone. There's help, and with help, they'll be well. So the more people that are talking about this, sharing their own experiences, I think can just increases and destigmatizes perinatal mental health.
What is the first thing a partner should do if they have suspicion but they're not sure that their partner is suffering from postpartum depression?
We'd really encourage them to talk to their partner, making sure that they have adequate information themselves. So going on the Postpartum Support International website, knowing what the signs to look for, and even bringing that information and bringing it in a really non-threatening way. Hey, I'm worried about you. This is what I'm noticing. Are you feeling this way too? I've looked up some resources. You're not alone. Here's how we can help. How can I help you?
I would imagine the partner who is not suffering would be concerned about the baby as well as their partner. And it's going to be a lot to try to figure out exactly what to do when you have your partner saying, I'm fine, I don't need any help.
It's talking about the other partner is likely also suffering, right? Having the lack of knowledge potentially for what's going on here with the new baby coming into the family environment, and the response being given, in the home by mom or even dad who might be suffering from postpartum depression. And I think speaking with the doctor, again, as you had talked to Donna about having the well, you both of you talking about having the follow-up, being there, maybe speaking with the doctor, and then also just to complement what you were saying, Amy, is that it's a partnership. So the whole partnership and family unit suffers. And if that, with that approach, in saying, I'm not alone, being compassionate, as you mentioned, which good partners would be, that often will help. And I think the online resources as well, being able to do the research, getting online, making the phone calls to the hotlines that you had mentioned earlier, those are also helpful, I think, for the partner looking for some information to help intervene.
Deb, I came into my mailbox a day or two ago, and there was a gift from you, and it was a book by Brooke Shields, who chronicles her journey through postpartum depression, which ends happily. And so I tried when I read the book to say, okay, what was it that brought on a good result? And what I learned from that was therapy talk, medication, and time. Donna, would that seem like that would work in a lot of the situations?
So I think it's hard to pull out that one situation and make a general answer for it. But we know that time is a great healer. We know that therapy works. We know there are many different types of therapy that people can engage in. And just support. Having someone like Amy that you can talk to about this. This is their area of expertise. Having a support group for both partners in it makes a huge difference. And I think the other part of it is the statistics are so small that Amy gave. We need more and better press to say 999 out of 1,000 are okay. Mm-hmm. That it's not postpartum depression. You don't hear about good news, the headlines are bad news. So it's bad press, I think, for a lot. So we want to open that lens to there's lots of recovery happening.
That's important. It goes all the way back in time to if it bleeds, it leads. You know, we hear about the horrible incidents. We don't hear a lot about the majority of people that do fine. Does it repeat itself if, in fact, a woman has postpartum depression, gets through it in time, has another child, does it reoccur generally? Or maybe you can't talk in general terms.
We can't talk in generals, but again, when we're looking at risk factors, so anybody who's had any type of pregnancy, and when I say pregnancy, I'm including any type of loss as well. That is also, just because somebody loses a pregnancy and doesn't have a living baby, they are still postpartum. So we still need to be assessing people. But any past postpartum mental health experience is a risk factor for a future. If somebody's been able to recover and has good support, it also lends to we can do some really great postpartum care planning. So when you mentioned some of the treatment options, do we want to make sure someone has a medication provider on board? Are we starting something earlier to try to get ahead if we're worried about a postpartum mood disorder reoccurring? And it just gives us a little bit more evidence of that person's own experience, which is going to be the best indicator versus these generalizations and hearing other people's stories, their own personal history.
Besides the spouse, besides the partner, besides someone like yourselves, who else might be helpful to somebody suffering?
Yeah, everybody. I really believe mental health is a systems issue, right? Adequate, paternity, maternity leave, corporations have a stake in that too. Are we expanding benefits for families so that they have adequate time at home? Anybody that touches that family, doctors, lactation consultants, doulas. We've been doing work on educating hairdressers, dentists, just all these allied professionals, anybody that comes into the life of somebody with children or with pregnancy, the more support we can give. There's some really great programs specifically in Massachusetts. There's a visiting moms program run through JFCS. And I think it's great because it doesn't put the onus only on the partner, as you were saying, to catch some of these mood symptoms, but it's somebody else who's in the home. So it's just as much support as we can give families.
Is there a way, in our final question for this portion of the show, we can address what we can use to really gauge if our friend, if our sister, if our daughter is suffering from postpartum depression?
Knowing the signs and what it looks for, not only depression or anxiety. Does mom or partner seem overly anxious about baby? Will they not let anybody else hold baby? Are they not leaving the house? Are they not showering or taking care of themselves or baby? Crying in situations that we wouldn't expect. Any kind of mood changes that we're looking for. So I think the best education we can give the public is knowing what the signs are. Irritability. And it's hard because we're not sleeping when we have these new babies in the house. And so we expect to be irritable and snappy and not our best selves. So ensuring that there's adequate support for sleep and then knowing who to go to.
So if the signs confirm the suspicions, what do you do next?
Again, that would be intervention. Do you mind if I just mention something?
Please.
Also, moms going back into the workforce, suffering from postpartum depression, that's another resource as well. If they have programs there or that supportive environment for being able to look for the signs and provide intervention. But I just wanted to, this is off of your question, I apologize, Dean Sullivan, but I wanted to thank you for mentioning how postpartum depression also does affect people who suffer loss. My husband and I suffered losses, and you with everything that you mentioned, it's certainly something that
I'm sorry.
See, this is a support group right here. So, but it's so important to validate that because those of us who have suffered loss and have gone through this, it's important because we're automatically dismissed. I don't want to call it labeling, but from
the community
exactly.
And that experience of being a mother.
Donna, final comments?
I think everything should be called Death Program Portals to Hope. I have great hope in recovery, that this is a difficult time to go through, but with the correct supports of all systems involved, And systems have become better educated to everything that Amy spoke about. The pediatrician, before you leave the hospital, partners are talked to. I speak with police, mental health clinicians have gone through extra training. The more of us that are aware of the symptoms to look for, the indicators, and also the protective factors, the easier it will be to intervene before someone is really in that intense pain. And that's our hope, that we can identify those indicators and put in some supports to best help that family.
Education tends to be the answer for lots of problems, and that's why we're so committed to trying to bring this kind of information to the general public, things we don't often hear about. So thank you for your contributions on this segment of the show. Joining me next is Professor Shane Rodriguez, a criminal defense attorney with an expertise in mental health litigation. He is also a professor here at the Massachusetts School of Law. Welcome, Shane.
Good morning.
Lindsay Clancy, a Massachusetts woman, was indicted on charges of murder and strangulation. She is accused of killing her 3 children before a failed attempt at killing herself. Shane, how does a defense attorney separate the cruelty of the heinous act from the mental illness that certainly must be present?
So one of the things I think that a criminal defense attorney, in this case, Attorney Kevin Reddington, is doing, and he's already started the process in terms of how he's defending her. Initially, he had to deal with the issue of whether or not Lindsay Clancy was competent to stand trial. There was a great concern by Attorney Reddington in the early days when she was being arraigned, moved to a mental health facility to have an evaluation to see if she was competent to stand trial. The issues surrounding whether or not she's competent to stand trial really take into consideration the over-medication, as Attorney Reddington described it. She was on 13 different medications, some antipsychotic medication, some antidepressant medications. In addition to that, the other concern is whether or not there is this what we call lack of criminal responsibility. We used to refer to that as not guilty by reason of insanity, and now in Massachusetts we call it lack of criminal responsibility. And what that means is whether or not the defendant, at the time she committed the offense, was she suffering from mental illness. So I think he's got those 2 things in motion right now in terms of addressing the issue with respect to competency. Is she able to assist her attorney at this present moment with respect to her ongoing criminal case? And then the separate and second issue is whether or not there's an issue of lack of criminal responsibility.
How often would you say that a defense of not guilty by reason of insanity able to prevail?
So a lot depends upon the facts and circumstances of the case. And a lot determines, based on those facts and considerations with respect to the case, it also then turns to the issue of hiring experts. And oftentimes, in order to prevail, defense attorneys will hire experts. Now, defense attorneys don't have to hire experts. They're not required to do that. Neither is the prosecution. But oftentimes, you need an expert to be able to help the jury to understand the facts and circumstances in this case and how and why and when Lindsay Clancy specifically was suffering from mental illness at the time of this issue. So it is prevalent that oftentimes attorneys will raise the defense of lack of criminal responsibility. There's a lot that's involved in that, and the defense attorney has to speak with his or her client to see if that's even an option of whether or not they want to do that, because there are risks. And one of the ultimate risks is that if a defendant chooses to raise lack of criminal responsibility, one of the outcomes of that could be that the defendant being found not guilty by reason of insanity could then be committed to a DMH facility or private mental health facility, initially for up to 6 months, and then, if still not well, the person could be recommitted for a year, and every year thereafter, they would then assess whether or not this person would continue to be committed in a mental health facility. And what we know is that oftentimes people can be in a mental health facility for years and years and years, and so they get caught up being committed year after year after year.
Bringing up experts, prosecutors will argue that she reported hearing voices only when an expert witness had been hired by her defense team. So Do experts really shape your preparation for the trial?
They do, and for the prosecution, it may be helpful for the prosecution to also be able to show through the use of experts that at the time Lindsay Clancy committed the killing of her 3 children, that she was sane. And remember too, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, there's a presumption that each defendant is sane, has sanity. And so the prosecution in the early stages of that can rely on that defense. But I think they're going to have to take it one step further, because the prosecution also bears the burden of proving beyond a reasonable doubt that at the time of committing the offense, the defendant was sane. And therefore cannot raise a lack of criminal responsibility defense. And so the experts on both sides, if they obtain experts, are going to really shape the issue for the trier of fact, the jury. And it's how relatable can those experts be to explaining what Lindsay Clancy was going through at that particular point in time. You know, there's this concern that Lindsay Clancy, again, was over-medicated, that she also suffered from postpartum psychosis. And we know that with postpartum psychosis, there are symptoms that mimic very closely symptoms of mental illness. One of the, as you just mentioned, the considerations that's being raised here is whether or not she suffered from hallucinations, auditory hallucinations, or what we call command auditory hallucinations. And command auditory hallucinations is part of what's going on here in this particular case. Lindsay Clancy said that she heard a man's voice telling her to kill not only her children, but to kill herself. And when you have a person who suffers from mental illness, who is exhibiting symptoms of command auditory hallucinations, that's one of the issues that has to be fleshed out in terms of whether or not she suffered from mental illness. And as a result of that mental illness, was there a nexus, meaning were there symptoms of command auditory hallucinations that did tell her to commit the act that she committed?
Wow. The fact that she made notes and had recurring thoughts about doing this, is that enough to constitute premeditated murder?
Certainly that's going to be an interesting piece of the litigation here when this goes to trial, because the prosecution will say that, following the murder, they looked at her cell phone, and that on her cell phone there were journals with respect to her mental health, her mental state and well-being, her daily activities, things that were going on. And the prosecution is alleging that Lindsay Clancy, her writings were very clear and that they showed no signs of hallucinations or delusions. Kevin Reddington will counter that and say that yes, during the time that she was on these 13 different medications and also potentially suffering from postpartum psychosis, which again, they're going to need an expert to be able to show that, the argument's going to be whether or not Lindsay Clancy was in fact suffering from postpartum psychosis, i.e. suffering from mental illness, or the prosecution's going to have to show that she wasn't, and that she knew what she was doing, and that as a result of those writings, it was premeditated.
We know so little about this topic. It's going to be, I think, hard to make a final resolution on this case. There's some criticism of her husband. He left the children home alone with his wife, knowing of her previous thoughts of harming them. If that is true, is there any legal theory that he could be held criminally responsible on?
So early on in this case, the belief is that Patrick Clancy, even though he knew that his wife was suffering from depression, was on antidepressant medication, was on an antipsychotic medication, that there were no medical professionals that were saying to Patrick Clancy, hey, you shouldn't leave your wife home alone. So I don't think in this instance, and it's my opinion at this point, that right now there's nothing to show that Patrick Clancy was somehow a someone who was who committed this crime with her. I think the focus is on the wife, and the wife who asked her husband to go out to 3 different restaurants and pick up meals at 3 different restaurants and also go to CVS. And again, that's the issue with respect to premeditation. I don't think there's anything that shows that Patrick Clancy was premeditating the murder. It seems as if, or the prosecution will argue that it was Lindsay Clancy who was premeditating this murder, that she also went online and she looked up how long it would take to go to each of those locations, and the prosecution will say that that's premeditation. The prosecution will also argue that when she sent her husband out, that she then sprang into action, took separate exercise bands, and then used those exercise bands to strangle her 3 children. The prosecution will also argue that it was premeditation when Lindsay Clancy then, as she was strangling each of her children, that because of the ligature marks from ligature strangulation, it takes several minutes to be able to strangle somebody and then ultimately kill them, and that she had time to think about it and time to stop, and that she didn't choose to stop and she continued to go forward with it. And then ultimately that she, in remorse or either desperation, then jumped from a second-floor window to try and take her own life. So I think the focus will be on Lindsay Clancy in terms of whether or not there was premeditation and deliberation, and not Patrick Clancy, at least not at this point.
I think, though, a number of people think at a minimum he was negligent.
So again, there's nothing to suggest that he didn't perform a duty of care to his wife. He was home with his wife. He knew that his wife suffered from depression. He knew that his wife was taking medications. At the time, it says that he knew that she was on, that he believed that she was on 3 medications and not 13 medications. And there's also no indication to suggest that as a result of taking those medications, that, at least from his perspective, that her condition was worsening. He had no idea that, well, it seems to appear that he had no idea of that, and thought that his wife was just dealing with the issue of, again, the postpartum with her children. And so at this point, I don't even know if there's an argument civilly that could be raised at this point, whether or not he owed her a duty of care and failed to do that.
Thank you for your wisdom here with us today, and I hope we can learn so much more about postpartum depression and psychosis, because certainly it seems to be something that the public needs to be aware of and we all need to address.
I agree with that, and I also will say in closing that I think it's important that any new parents, whether husband or wife or partner, needs to be able to reach out to folks and seek the treatment and help that they need. There's early screening and intervention that can be done, and that is done oftentimes leading up to the 3rd trimester and even afterwards. So I would encourage those people who are listening to this video, this communication, that if they're suffering from postpartum, that they reach out and get the help to be able to deal and handle that type of issue that they're facing.
Thank you, Shane. We need to take a short break. We'll be right back.
Earning your law degree shouldn't burden you with overwhelming debt. At Massachusetts School of Law at Andover, we believe it should be affordable, achievable, and yes, even an enjoyable first step to your successful career. We believe in an atmosphere of support, flexible class scheduling, and hiring professors with real-world experience, ensuring you leave law school with the professional skills you need. We are the most affordable law school in New England, and we believe in you.
The Massachusetts School of Law. Your future starts here.
Welcome back. Our topic for this segment of the show is recovering from sexual violence. According to the CDC, over half of women and almost 1 in 3 men have experienced sexual violence involving physical contact during their lifetimes. 1 in 4 women and about 1 in 26 men have experienced rape or attempted rape. With such statistics, we hear a lot about this problem, but we hear little about the best steps for recovery. Donna, I'd like to begin with you and ask you, if you would, for the audience, define sexual violence and sexual assault.
Thank you for that question. Let's all have the same definition of what we're talking about. And I'm going to give you the definition from the National Sexual Violence Resource Network, which is one of the prize places we go for information. Sexual violence means that someone forces or manipulates someone else into unwanted sexual activity. It is without their consent. Consent's a very important part of this. Reasons why someone may not consent include fear, age, illness, disability, influence of drugs or alcohol, and important to know that anyone can experience sexual violence. Children, teens, adult, elderly. And those who sexually abuse can be acquaintances, family members, trusted individuals, or strangers. And I object to the statistics around sexual violence. This is a very private crime. It is not reported. As I'm sure Deb will speak about in relation to domestic violence, sexual assault happens in intimate relationships and it's just not reported. So the statistics are sketchy. Also for males, it is, I think, sometimes due to our society attitudes around being a male, very, very hard to report a sexual assault for a male. So I think it's about our ability to understand what some of the indicators might be in the population to look for and offer them some help.
And also the number for children are substantially higher. I mean, I was shocked when much of the average is around 1 in 13 boys. 25% of all girls have experienced some type of, sexual assault or violence. Those numbers are just terrible.
And for young women, for girls, it may well happen before they're 14. So another point of where all of our systems need to learn what the indicators may be to identify someone who might be in that predicament and offer an intervention.
Thank you for those comments. Deb, you were a victim of sexual assault. Walk us through your recovery.
So, Dean, firstly, I'm glad that you used that word victim because I myself use them interchangeably. There's often this interchangeably with survivor because it's important, even though we have graduated and gravitated towards the usage of the word survivor, which is absolutely on point. It's still important for us to remind people that having survived that crime, I was a victim of domestic violence and sexual assault. I was a victim of a crime. And unfortunately, sometimes in society, we kind of negate that when we look at using the word victim, which is in its true purpose. We often say victims are weak or there are myths around victimization. So these types of crimes that don't discriminate, but certainly, as we know, largely impact women and children. And so I'm glad that you used that term. So I was engaged to a man who served in the Coast Guard, and he was. I was in a relationship, an engaged relationship with him. He became first verbally abusive, and then physically abusive, and the sexual assault incidents that later took place were extremely difficult for me as a survivor to be able to report those to the police. And they were kind of left off the table initially, except that I had listed, very important for us as law students hoping to practice and advocate for people, was my affidavit. And in the affidavit, while I had listed the sexual assaults that had taken place, when it went forward in the court, in the criminal justice system, as we walked forward through that, it was dropped, of course, that particular crime and the other crimes that my offender who sexually assaulted me, the other crimes that he pled out to. So, most of these crimes we see, somewhat frustratingly so, are pled out in the system. And in my case, my offender was charged and sentenced for 2 domestic assault and battery with a dangerous weapon, which was a knife, in which he used also during the sexual assault. 3 counts of domestic threats to assault, 2 domestic assault and battery crimes, and 12 counts of a violation of the 209A abuse prevention order, the restraining order. But again, off the table in the process was the sexual assault. And in part, I think when we look at sexual assault cases, they can be difficult to prove. I'm probably going to defer back to Donna on some of that stuff with respect to working clinically in the hospitals, but also you have to have a SANE worker, for example, a sexual assault advocate available if you are going to the hospital to get tested, which is almost the predominant piece of evidence that a survivor, a victim of sexual assault, crime, or rape it needs in order for that case to even move forward. So the healing process then from that is kind of a tricky one, because we walk through the process in seeking justice. And I was lucky, I had a lot of support, including from the police department. And, but I was acutely aware that the Sexual Assault Act, that crime, was left off the table and wasn't part of him being made to be accountable.
Because it was part of the plea?
Yes, yes.
And you were fully willing to cooperate with all
yes.
required testimony, etc., which often is a problem. You know, women don't want it, for a whole host of reasons we won't get into today. Women don't want to come on the stand and testify, and so you were willing to do so, but he pled out to lesser charges.
And that's important that you mention that also, because one of the things that we do as clinicians and advocates is encourage people to walk through the court process. And as an advocate, that means that we are friends to people who are complete strangers to us, right? As we all are here, in advocating and encouraging someone to walk through the criminal justice process. And I'm from Portal to Hope. So we're always hopeful and encourage hope in the survivors whom we're working with, to have faith and trust in a system that may not be entirely equipped to help us entirely. So that's, that piece, being able to encourage someone to walk through the criminal justice process I think is critically important actually to someone's healing, in fact.
Let's pause for a moment, though, Deb, and recognize you were a victim of sexual assault, and you've gone forward and you have founded an organization to help women who have a similar experience, and I can't compliment you enough on doing that.
Well, thank you. I had a lot of help, including from organizations like the one that Donna worked at, HAWK, Help for Abused Women and Children, and some of my team members that are former graduates of Mass School of Law. I had a lot of help in forming the organization, and that's, as we talked a little bit earlier, exploring those support systems is also very important as part of a healing process, and it's cathartic.
Sure.
As you said, Amy, earlier, we get into these fields often because of, what has happened to us. I mean, Dean, look at your own story of survivorship, everything that you've gone through yourself, is struggling with illness, it's struggling with loss of people in your life. And, it's so important that, again, that we're able to practice, in a sense, what we know, in that we want to be helping someone else who might be experiencing the same plight.
When a woman or a man has been sexually assaulted, where's the best place to go to begin the healing recovery process?
It's a hard question. I would ask the person who came in, what would be the least painful for you right now? What would be the most supportive for you? The victim has all the answers. They're the expert in their experience. I'm a compassionate observer. So eliciting that information from the victim is very important, because you want to give them control over something where they feel they have no control. It was that point where they had no control that has put them in this predicament, So I want to offer control back. How would you like to go forward? One of the best things that I can offer to someone is believing them. A little bit about what Deb said. There are some folks in our system that diminish the event, and that's not helpful for anyone. So, being a medical advocate, those sane nurses, a clinician, if someone comes in and talks about that experience, first I say thank you, and I'm sorry for your loss.
Many women, I understand, carry guilt from the sexual assault. I wonder if you might talk about that.
Speaking as an Irish Catholic woman, I have a lot of guilt over a million things. I think society makes women feel guilty over a number of things. For sexual assault, both men and women will carry some guilt. And I think that's something that can be worked out on their way to recovery. That's not saying that you'll never get over that guilt, but I think we can make it less of a sharp sword.
I wonder if you would take me through what you would say to a victim who you're encouraging to put this behind them.
I think the first point, like colleagues here have mentioned, acknowledging that you believe them, you're sorry for their loss, you're sorry this happened to them, and in whatever way they need to start their road to recovery, you're there to support them. I think generalizations can be tricky because every person's story is so different. But believing anybody that comes in, I'm in private practice, so believing anybody that comes into my office, I'm getting people at a very different point in their recovery than maybe Deb and Donna are. So I think that first step, echoing believing them and making sure that we as providers know what support systems look like, so we can offer these are options if and when you want to choose them.
I understand that many women that are victims of sexual assault will then go on to suffer PTSD, might get engaged with drugs, with alcohol as coping methods. And in some ways, I think we all appreciate and understand that. What surprised me, though, there are triggers. For example, if your assailant had on a certain type of cologne, and you're 2 years later and somebody walks by wearing that same cologne, that can be a trigger to a near collapse for women. So I wonder if you might comment on those triggers.
That could be an activator, but my hope is in the 2 years since that happened, that they have learned some coping strategies to calm themselves. I'm safe. This isn't the same situation. There are people who will turn to drugs and alcohol who have never been sexually assaulted. There are people who develop post-traumatic stress disorder from having lived through a hurricane. It's not an equal sign, sexual assault and post-traumatic stress disorder. It's never an equal sign. It depends on so many factors. And I think we, the three of us, will treat each person as an individual and see what they're coming in with and help that individual identify what is going to be the most helpful for you. What's the most helpful for me may not work for Deb, may not work for Amy. You tell me what is going to be the most helpful. And many times those first couple of sessions, victims are unable to articulate it. And I'm perfectly fine sitting, offering different options. And you tell me when you might be ready to take that on. So it's never an equal sign in my clinical work that someone who has been through a traumatic event will develop substance abuse or post-traumatic stress disorder.
Deb, what are some of the things that helped you the most besides the support you got from family, friends, outsiders, the police department? What other things would you recommend to others that they might think about whether that could be helpful?
In the immediate moments, going to someone for help who is a professional in the area, groups like Portal to Hope and Hawk and other organizations. Elliot, for example, going to someone like Donna or Amy or even us as advocates. No question that's a help, but I'll be honest with you, I facilitate support groups. We've been facilitating them for 29 years now. And people will drop off from the support groups, because even in the support groups, going back to something you were mentioning, someone might be in the support group and not feel that their case, having heard someone else's case, is as bad. When it's so important, as Donna had mentioned, there's not one size that fits all. Everybody's case is as equally, can be as equally traumatic and important. I will share that to this day, I'm still recovering. So I get on the elevator at the school, partly because I twisted my knee today, but because I've developed trauma manifests itself in so many different ways that even we're unprepared for. So claustrophobia, anxiety, panic attacks, which will cause somebody to isolate and retreat. So those types of signs are important because they're indicative of someone who might be struggling and in need of help. And for myself, we as survivors, we have to take our power back. And that is a journey. It's a self journey in one end and a supportive journey entirely in another. And so I get on the elevator, and I was recently stuck on an elevator with Laurie, and who never heard so many F-bombs probably before in her life. But there's a reason for practicing what we call cognitive behavioral skills therapy, right? And trying to reconnect the disconnected piece, because surviving sexual assault in order to move forward requires us to disconnect and compartmentalize, even if for some moments, and we kind of have to reconnect our minds with our bodies to make sure that we're whole again, in a sense. I don't know when that will be, for, I think, right. Because triggers come up through a lifetime, but as you said, the coping mechanisms are things that, we learn and try to practice as best as we can.
How does this all change when the abuser is a family member?
The abuser could be your partner, your life partner. The abuser could be your older brother. The perpetrator could be your grandfather. Think about what is shattered in that happening to a child. This is the person that you're supposed to love and trust and guide you through life, who has just invaded your space, and more than that. Working with kids who have experienced this, it's really tough for kids, but kids are also resilient. Kids are very resilient. Adults are too. But what I particularly like about working with kids is checking back with them a year or two later, where one of my younger kids said, "It's like I have a scar now.
Mm.
The skin healed over and I have a scar." So for family members, and Deb can speak from domestic violence, it's horrific. It's horrific. The people that you live with, that you trust the most, that you love, have put you in that predicament.
So as we've talked about before, things like talk therapy, medication, in time, are those also powerful healers for sexual violence victims?
There's art therapy, which is so helpful. You're sitting at a table across from you and maybe coloring, doodling. There's music therapy for both kids and adults. There's many, many choices out. One will not help everyone, but one person will find something in each of those modalities to help them to move forward.
Absolutely. I was actually going to point to some of those things. Exercise. You've often advocated for that through the women's issues class and through different forums like this. Exercising, breathing exercises. As Donna had mentioned, music, art therapies, we call them alternative therapies today. Poetry writing, journaling, things like that. Especially with children, because they're easier they are more likely, I should say, to write something down, especially if they're creating something and sharing their stories in that way.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for joining me today. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I learned a lot. plenty of my own misconceptions about what we were going to talk about. In any event, thank you all so very much. I wish you the best. And to our viewing audience, until next time, be well.